Okay, let's make a start, shall we? The development of administrative and government structures under the Anglo-Norman kings, by which we mean William, and Henry primarily here, is a kind of transitional thing from what the late Anglo-Saxons are doing towards what we see later in the 12th century under the Angevins, which is a very clear established system. And primarily what happened under the Normans is a kind of number of processes working together. One of them, which I mentioned before, is this process of combining different elements and then coming out with something new. There's a phrase in English, I don't know whether they have it in the States, when you get married, the lady, I think it's the lady, supposed to have something old, something borrowed, something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, or whatever. Now, I'm not sure about the blue bit, but Anglo-Norman government and what ends up being Angevin government definitely had something old, something kind of borrowed, taken from elsewhere, and then finally something new. So it's a combination of the existing Anglo-Saxon arrangements. They didn't kind of completely throw that out the window. They bring in their own, they introduce new elements from Normandy into the existing one, and then new things emerge in England as a result of this mixture and as a result of the experimentation that's going on. At the same time, what we can see, and partly is connected to that process perhaps, I think, is a shift from what you might define as kind of personal government, focused on the king and his personal entourage, those supporters around him to whom he could rely on and to whom he gave special duties and things. A shift from that to a far more impersonal government that we see emerging later in the 12th century, which is the basis for kind of medieval and even early modern government structures and so on. So the king is still very important, but things are not, the relationships and organisation is not quite so personal and connected just to his person. And a good example of that is the way that a number of important, ultimately very important offices or parts of medieval English government primarily emerge from the king's court, or what we might at this point call his household. Okay? Around the person of the king, who obviously was the top of the hierarchy, there was a collection of people, some of whom he had a personal relationship with, his knights, his family, and so on. Others who he had connections with and used for various purposes, and used their skills and things like that. And this kind of combination of family and friends and supporters and other things we would call the household. And this group, which is partly a group of people, but also a kind of set of positions and everything else, would to some extent kind of move around with the king. Early medieval kingship, and even to some extent in the central Middle Ages, was what we call itinerant to a large extent. Itinerant means what? Yeah, okay. Well, itinerant means kind of not static, not in one place, moving around. I mean, the best way for a medieval king in a period when you didn't have a standing army and modern communications and all these things, some guy who's just sitting there in London has got very little ability to really know what's going on, say, up in the north. Okay, unless he goes there. So what the king's court would do would move around, this is a common thing in the early Middle Ages, would move around the kingdom to constantly kind of remind people that I am the king, and to collect taxes and to discuss things with local noblemen and things like that. So England was no exception to that extent. Kings were to a large extent itinerant, but they ceased to be, they become less so over time. And so the king, round the king, was this group of people and positions and other things which we call the household. If the king, as was often the case with the Normans, was not in the kingdom, because he was in Normandy, obviously, and William himself spent a lot of time in Normandy, then there would be a viceroy, someone under the king, often called a justiciar, usually a close relative, who would kind of keep things going while the king was not there on his behalf, and would obviously communicate with the king and so on. So that's why I've drawn that kind of roughly parallel. Okay, but the justiciar obviously would be connected to some extent to the household as well. Under Henry, we see the household changing and developing in a number of important ways. Okay, its movements and itinerary become more sort of structured and controlled and less kind of flexible. We see the emergence of what's sometimes called Great Council, a set of particularly important people who would talk with the king and decide things with the king, that is part of the emerging out of the household as well. And payments, sometimes called renders to the household as taxes, were shifting from payments in kind to monetary payments. Okay, payments in kind, if we say this, what does that phrase mean in English? Do you know? If I say you're making a payment in kind, products, produce, it might be food or something, primarily things like that, which is obviously what the court needs. The court needs food, and so it would impose itself and collect food renders in kind, as we say. But there is a shift in the early 12th century towards monetary payments as a kind of form of taxation or something to support the household and things. So we see things are kind of developing a little bit during this period. The three main offices that we see emerging during this time, well, later on it becomes known as the Chancery, then the Treasury I mentioned before, and the Exchequer. The Chancery was under control of an officer called the Chancellor, and originally it was the kind of writing office for the king. So any decisions or any other things which the king wished to make, obviously he didn't do his own writing, he had effectively secretaries under the control of the Chancellor. So this scriptorium or writing office was part of the household. Okay, it was part of his personal writing office, controlled by this guy. But later on, it becomes a formal section of government. Okay, it becomes a formal part of the government process. But it begins life in this more loose collection, which we call the household there. And one of the most important things, the Chancellor controlled what we call the Great Seal, which is not the animal, the seal, which jumps around in the water, but something else. Anyone guess what the Great Seal, the Great obviously because it's the king's one, what is a seal then? Yeah, a kind of stamp, a way of often closing or validating documents, okay? And it's a stamp, and you'll have hot wax, and if you stamp onto the wax, there's a particular imprint there, which when it cools down, you can see, okay, and that is the king's seal. So to prove that the king has prepared this document, you will attach or close it or whatever with the seal. So very important to make sure that everyone, if there is no seal attached, obviously you're not certain about whether it's coming from the king or not. So the Chancery, as we call it, emerging as this writing office and looking after the king's affairs, organising things in that sense. In addition, as we said, there is the Treasury, which was a large part of the king's or the household's wealth, which stayed in one place, originally, as I said, located not in London, but originally located in the city of Winchester. There was a smaller amount of wealth other things which the household would carry it around with itself for daily necessary needs and so on. But large part of the wealth was located in Winchester, and obviously that's, as I said, why in one case Henry I went there. Once he secured the treasury, once he had the wealth, he had the sort of starting point for establishing his claim to be king. And again, that originates as the kind of king's personal wealth, but then it becomes effectively the wealth of the country, in a sense. And connected to that, for obvious reasons, is the office which also emerges during this time, particularly under Henry I, called the Exchequer. Okay? And this was a way of basically looking after or checking the annual income of well, the king or the government in a broader sense. And they met twice a year, and there was a checkered cloth which they put on a table. Checked is this kind of pattern. Okay, and you would move things around on there to calculate, like an abacus or something, move things to calculate income and outgoings and calculate totals and things like that. So it becomes known as the Exchequer because of this cloth that they used to cover the table or something like that and make the calculations. And this becomes very, very important office, particularly in the reign of Henry II, okay, but it begins life in a recognisable form under Henry I as a way of seeing outgoings and incomings and seeing what monasteries and noblemen are paying as taxes and other things and other payments, gelds to the king and what else is owed and things like that, keeping a track of these things, as obviously any organisation should do. And the documents which, we've got one example from Henry I's reign, the documents which record the main activities of the Exchequer are known, or come to be known as pipe rolls, and they're very important sources for Henry II's reign and later, but we've got one from Henry I that survive, probably others which have been unfortunately lost, and they tell us a lot about the organisation of government and the relationship between central government and localities and so on. So these are just a few examples of kind of central government as it emerges out of primarily the personal household or court of the king. In the localities, which is why I've put this map up, but it's not a perfect one, let's just remind ourselves a little bit, and we talked a bit about this during the break, during the discussion after Azra's presentation. The Normans inherited from the Anglo-Saxons the administrative structure of the whole kingdom, where the whole of the kingdom was broken up into shires, or what can also be called counties, again using a French word. It's essentially the same thing. This is the English word, this is the French equivalent. And still today, England is organised primarily, broken up into shires. Shires originally emerging down here in Wessex, okay, under the early West Saxon kings, and as they spread their power, the system of shiring, of breaking up and organising things in that way was spread as their power went and so on. And as Azra said, each shire was in theory controlled or responsible with a sheriff, and below the shire, each shire in turn was subdivided into another unit called the hundred. Okay, and in late Anglo-Saxon England, there was a periodic court to look into legal and cases of justice at the shire, and also hundreds had their own courts as well to deal with more local problems and so on. So organising local issues, organising and solving disputes between people and so on could be done either very locally at the hundred level, which is a relatively small area, or depending on the nature of the problem, it might go higher up to the shire court, or in some cases it might end up being, people might end up appealing to the king. And the Normans kind of took this system over and refined it and made it work more effectively. when we get into the Danelaw and into the north, things kind of break down a bit, okay, and you get very big shires compared to what you get in the original ones further south. So someone like Yorkshire is very big. And in these Scandinavianized areas, you don't get hundreds, you get various other units. The most important one for the Viking areas, wapentakes, which means weapon takes, the group of men from an area who would take up their weapons for various purposes and so on. So they're defined in terms of their collective activity and so on. But they were more or less equivalent in the Danelaw to the hundreds in the southern parts of England, had a similar function, but there were some differences of organisation and so on. One of the things which happened particularly under the Normans is also the emergence of kind of independent areas of jurisdiction, because some of the Norman lords, some of William's followers and their successors, were not just under the king, but had little regions where they themselves had certain powers, and these are sometimes called honours. Okay? And there are a number of these regions where the lord could hold court and other things independent of what is going on in the shires and the hundreds and so on. It's his little region of jurisdiction. And at a lower level, as we see later on, even individual manors. What's a manor? Do we know what a manor is? What does that word mean?
Like a house, a big house, like mansion or something else.
Yeah, it has a number of meanings. There is the sense of referring to a building. Sometimes will just be called the manor house, and that's the centre of a slightly larger area, primarily a big farm or estate. Okay, fields with people living there working for the lord of the manor. So it was the most basic unit for most people in the Central and later Middle Ages in England, but in a way elsewhere in Europe as well. You lived on a village, and in many cases the village was the manor, and the village belonged to a certain lord, an aristocrat. He would have had his house and people who worked for him there. He wouldn't always spend his time there and so on. So the main unit was this village or manor, though the manor and village were not always identical. And we see the emergence later of manor courts as well. So certain arguments and problems between people that are occurring just within a particular manor or village might even be dealt with at that very local level as well. And then intermediary, we see these honours, and then higher up, as I said, we've got this system of shires and hundreds to organise local things and so on. Okay, that's primarily what I wanted to say about government. The main point, as we said, is that kind of everything is happening during this period. Things are shifting and changing under the early Norman kings, and the significant organisation of administration and justice and government that we see in the later 12th century, no doubt emerging from late Anglo-Saxon and early Norman organisation. Okay, let's turn to Domesday Book. And if anyone was not here on Tuesday and doesn't have a copy of Domesday Book, or has forgot to bring their copy along, then I can pass a few spare ones out. Most historians would agree that Domesday Book is one of, if not the, sort of greatest product of the Middle Ages in Britain, okay, in terms of what was achieved, in terms of surveying, not quite all, but a large part of a significant kingdom, and then breaking it down into a number of factors and units in order to understand what was going on in the country and so on. It was a great achievement, okay, and it reflects on the personal organisation and skills not only of the king but those around him as well. I'll read a slightly longer version of the same passage which Azra quoted in her presentation before from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, because it gives us an introduction, a background to what's going on. Okay. After this, the king had important deliberations and exhaustive discussions with his council about this land, about England, how it was peopled and with what sort of men. Then he sent his men all over England into every shire to ascertain, to find out how many hundreds of hides of land there were in each shire, and how many land and livestock, animals, the king himself owned in the country, and what annual dues, taxes, were lawfully his from each shire. He also had it recorded how much land his archbishops had, and his diocesan bishops, his abbots, and his earls. And though I may be going into too great detail, and what and how much each man who was a landholder here in England had in land or in livestock, and how much money it was worth. So very thoroughly did he have the inquiry carried out that there was not a single hide, that's an area of land, not one virgate of land, not even, it is shameful to record it, but it did not seem shameful to him to do, not even one ox, not one cow, not one pig, which escaped notice in this survey. All the surveys were subsequently brought to him. Okay, so in slightly flowery language, basically, the land, the people, and the animals of England were recorded in a massive database, okay, which is what we, in a sense, would still do today. Now, before we have a little discussion of the text, we've got to kind of get some distinctions clear in our head. When we talk about Domesday Book, we talk on the one hand about the actual inquest or inquiry, the process of asking and finding out things, and on the other hand, the actual survey or book which resulted from that. And it's been argued more recently that these two things were significantly distinct, that the process of finding out was done at one stage under William I, as we just saw, but the actual main manuscript that we have may actually be later, okay, and it's debated, and the actual description comes perhaps even from William Rufus's reign. Traditionally we see them as part of the same thing, and some historians, one in particular called David Roth, has argued that we have to separate these things out, and the actual manuscript and what's going on might be later, and so on. And as far as I know, scholars are still discussing and debating this issue. And I'll say a little bit then about the inquiry and the writing up, and then we'll look at the text itself. So what they did was they decided first to organise or to break up, for practical purposes, break up England into 7, what we now call circuits. And this is what this map is here, okay? The circuits were a collection of 3, 4, 5, 6, depending on the size and so on, shires or counties, okay? So here's the first, what we now call the first circuit, which was Hampshire, Sussex, Surrey and Kent. Here's the 7th circuit, Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex, okay? And here up in the 6th one is the most northern one. We have Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, and the very north, Northumberland and Cumbria around here and so on, didn't actually get surveyed properly, or we don't have records of that. And again, it's because the north was still a difficult area, and they had caused a lot of trouble up there not too long ago. Each of these circuits was given a number of what we now in English will call commissioners, guys who are responsible for finding out what was in that circuit, what was in the shires in that circuit. So let's put shires to circuits, and then they're under the responsibility of these commissioners. And they drew up lists of the manors and so on in these shires, in these circuits. Then the commissioners went to the shire courts, the county courts. They met in the individual shires, and local people and local landowners, lords and so on, some English and some Norman, who we call jurors, came and met the commissioners and answered a series of questions about the land and so on. And we have one document which might or might not record examples of these questions. Then the results of this were organised according to the hundreds. So for each hundred they recorded things and the manors inside that hundred, okay, and they wrote down the answers to their questions and put them into what we call the returns, okay. So we organise the shires into circuits. Commissioners go there, and for each shire in the circuit they meet jurors. They get and clarify information about landholding, about the manors, and they organise that by hundred, by the smaller units, and write them up into these returns. And we've got one or two documents which may relate to these returns as well. Then these returns were put together, okay, and reorganised as sometimes called circuit summaries. So a big collection relating to all the answers for one of these circuits, okay, all put together, all brought together, brought from different places, different meetings. Now let's write them all up into another manuscript, put them all together, and now this time they organised it not geographically, but they organised the information of manors according to the feudal hierarchy. So in the first case, they came to this hundred and they said, okay, here's a manor in this hundred, tell us about the value of this, 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 and this manor here. Then we'll go to the next manor in this hundred, now to here. That's what we get in the returns. Now, they reorganise the bits and they say, okay, tell us about all the manors which Chara has. They might be in this hundred or this hundred or this hundred, we don't care, as long as they're in this shire, and we'll put them all together. So they kind of rearrange bits. And then we want Azra's manors, again, from the different hundreds, and rearrange them that. So now it's according to landholder, not according to place, not according to geographic organisation. And we have one of these which survives, which is for, what am I saying? It's for Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex, okay? And this is what we sometimes call Little Domesday Book. Finally, the plan was to put all of these summaries, organised this way, re-edit them again into the final big book, okay, which we now call Great Domesday Book, which is what is housed in London. You can go and see it. And they took these ones and they chopped them around a little bit. They took things out, they rearranged them a little bit. So they made them a bit shorter and they wrote them all up into one big manuscript. So we begin with returns for hundreds, according to shire. Then in the circuit summaries, it's all of the shires together for one circuit. And finally, everything together in one big book. But they didn't finish this. They did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and for some reason they not got round to writing up number 7. They didn't finish this big manuscript. So Great Domesday Book that we have today is the first 6 circuits, and the 7th one only survives in this Little Domesday Book that we have as a separate manuscript. Traditionally we say that maybe William the Conqueror died, so they stopped copying the things up because the king was no longer there, so the need to do it was not. But if David Roth and others are correct, and the book was a later product of the inquest, not an immediate or direct one, then obviously something else was going on. But it's not complete, it's not finished. But that's luckily in a way, because what we have for here, and we have something also surviving from down here called Exeter or Exon Domesday, they're a bit more detailed than the final one. But what you've got here is material relating to Herefordshire in the 5th Circuit, this area here on the Welsh border. Okay, and that's quite significant. What is the first, I'm hoping that at least some of you have had a go at looking at this, the first page and a half, what is going on here? What are we looking at in the first bit, which is a kind of introduction or preface to the real meat of this Shire account? What is the first page and a half telling us about?
It tells how many people live in that specific place, their profession, what they own. And also it talks about some legal
Yes.
issues too.
Some of the things that were gathered were what we sometimes call, or recorded for some places, customs, the laws, the kind of unofficial laws of that place.
For example, what happens when somebody steals something?
Yes, they may have special laws organising that particular city, and these are often Anglo-Saxon laws going back from a few hundred years. We begin, it says at the top, with the city of Hereford. That's the central city of Herefordshire, obviously, okay. And then halfway down the second page, it says in Archenfield, or Arkenfield. And this was a region somewhere down here that had been Welsh until quite recently, and so it had its own kind of organisation. Okay, it was an old Welsh kingdom called Erging, and so it had its own customs and organisation here. And so it talks about if a Welshman does that, and so on. So we begin with these customs, these rules and laws about Hereford and Arkenfield. And we have a few more examples of this, but they don't occur, I don't think, in every single shire in Domesday books. So let's step over that. And the first thing to notice is what we've got on this long column here. Here are noted those holding land in Herefordshire and in Archenfield and in Wales. Okay, the bit of Wales gets dealt with in this part of Domesday book as well. Number 1, the king. Number 2, the Bishop of Hereford. 3, the Church of Cormay, and it carries on down, all the way down to, at the end, you see guys who don't even have surnames. 26, Madog, Edrich and Elmer. 1 Welshman and 2 Anglo-Saxons there, in fact, not Normans at all. This is the list of landholders. It's also like a contents page for a book. Okay? When you open a book, you want to see where chapter 1 is, where chapter 2 is, and things like that. This is effectively telling you the structure of this according to the person. Because, as I said, at this level, when they came to writing things up into the circuit summaries, they rearranged the information according to feudal hierarchy, according to the landholder, not initially according to where places were. Do you notice anything interesting about the order? Anything significant about the order of people here? Is there any pattern or important arrangement?
Church after the king.
Yep.
So this actually shows that the land of the churches weren't stolen.
Yeah. This records what lands individual bishops or the cathedrals of the bishops and the monasteries held. Not all of them are English monasteries, we should add. Some of them are monasteries that in Normandy that have English lands and so on. But as you were saying in your presentation, the church was not deprived of its land by any means after the conquest, though there may have been some arguments and problems here and there. But first we have the king. Okay? Then we have the church, and then we have laymen afterwards. And within the church, we obviously have the Bishop of Hereford first, most important guy. And then when you look at the names of the secular lay landowners, you see first of them, you may not recognize this, but most of them have got, the first list have got Norman names. So it's things like Ralph and Roger and William and Henry and things like that. And that carries on for a long way. And then we We get an Alfred later on, but he's got a foreign surname. And it's only right at the end do we get people, as I said, called Griffith or Maddock, which are Welsh names, or Eadrich and Elmer, which are English names. So there is clearly a hierarchy, a feudal hierarchy in a sense, a social hierarchy in the way this is organised. King, church, lay landholders, and then within those there is a certain hierarchy as well. And this is quite a common way of doing it in Domesday, but they don't just say, okay, who shall we have next? There is a priority. Now, what basically was going on is that ultimately the king kind of owns all of the land. Okay, the land of England is his. But what he does is he gives bits of land away or confirms already existing possession of land by other people on his behalf to other people. But if he's not happy with them, in theory, he can take it back in a sense. Okay, we haven't gone into the details of what we understand by feudal tenure and so on here, but we have the king, and then underneath him we have his tenants, people who teneo, who hold the land from him. And at the top, these are always called the tenants in chief, okay, which is primarily these guys here. And then below them, they, in turn, gave this land sometimes to other people, okay, who are their tenants that we would call now subtenants. Okay, this is sub-infeudation, and it might go on to a number of levels. And the king, therefore, holds some land directly. He keeps it for himself because he needs land. But also, most of the land he gives away as a way of showing his favour, as a way of getting people to become his vassals, to support him, and things like that. And they then sub-infeudate the land in turn. So that's why we begin with the land of the king. All of it is the land of the king. What this means is his domain land, the land that he's kept directly under his control. Okay. So the first example, let's just read that because I can see it coming up. King William holds Linton. This is in Brommarsh 100. King Edward held it. There were 5 hides, and they rendered the 4th part of one knight's farm. Now it is greatly decreased. There are in domain 3 ploughs, and 10 villains, and 5 borders with 12 ploughs. There are 6 slaves, and a mill rendering 8 pennies, denarii. There are 1 Frenchman holds half a hide, which rendered 4 shillings, TRE, which means in the time of King Edward, blah, blah, blah. Now this manor, as it now renders 10 pounds of blanched pennies, and it carries on, okay, the other people who hold bits of this and so on. So here's one typical example of the king's domain land and the points we've got. Let's jump forward to, I don't know, let me think of, find a page outside of the king's land and take a more representative example, okay. Okay, let's go to page 500. And there you see in the second column, these lands which follow belong to the canons of Hereford. Okay, these are guys connected to the cathedral at Hereford under the bishop. In Stretford 100, in Lulham are 8 hides paying geld, paying tax. In domain is 1 plough and 11 villains and 5 borders with 13 ploughs. There is 1 female slave and 3 acres of meadow. There could be 1 more plough in domain, so there's some uncertainty there. Of this land, 2 clerks, 2 clerics, hold 2 hides and 3 virgates, and 1 knight holds 1 hide. These have in domain 2 ploughs, and 13 villains and 2 borders with 8 ploughs. Tempore regis Edwardi, in the time of King Edward, it was waste. Now it is worth 10 pounds. okay, what kind of questions? We've taken just 2 examples. What things can we see recurring in these 2 examples? One from Williams Holdings, one from... So what can we see recurring here? Remember, these guys, these commissioners were going, asking fairly consistent questions, in theory, throughout the kingdom, okay? And this is just one example. And to make use of this, to make sense of this as historians, we need there to be some kind of consistency. So what things can we see emerging here from...
They rate the land based on its agricultural output, based on the number of... They're using plows to signify how much of it can be farmed. And that's why, is that the demens? Is that, what does that mean?
That's the domain, well, that's controlled directly in a sense, okay. In each case, we've seen the word hide recurring. So what are they looking at here? It says, in Lulham are 8 hides paying geld. We go further down, it says, in Preston on Wye are 6 hides. On Tiverton are 6 hides paying geld, blah, blah, blah. What did I say a hide was? It's a unit of land, it's an area, a region, okay? It goes back to ancient Anglo-Saxon ideas and so on. So the first thing they're doing is saying, how big is this? What's the area of this manor, of this ville, as it's sometimes called, and so on. And then we've mentioned the number of ploughs, which is the agricultural material. Villeins and bordars, any idea what they are? Villagers, and borders is another kind of villager with a certain status, slightly different status and so on. So who are the people living and working there? Okay. What else? So and there's other kinds of people. The clerks have land there, but they're not working there as such in a night and so on. So who holds the land, but also who works it in a sense. What else are they asking here? Most of the entries finish, it says TRE.
Yeah, they're comparing it to before, trying to assess the change from, I'm guessing, the Saxon control to now their control.
Yes, yeah, you sometimes get, that's the main recurring thing. What was it worth at the time of King Edward, in 1066 in effect? Sometimes you get even more subtle things, earlier in the reign of William or whatever it might say, but primarily this TRE, Tempore Regis Edwardi. In the time of King Edward, it was this much, and primarily it was worth this amount, okay? And all the cases we've got here, it says that the land was waste, it wasn't being used, it was of no value and so on. But now, modo in Latin, it is worth £10, okay? The next one now worth 10 shillings, now worth £3 and things like that. At the end of the day, what William and his guys are concerned with is what's it all worth to us, okay? We made an effort to get this kingdom. We killed the illegal king, blah, blah, blah. We've had a lot of trouble with the northerners. Now we're in control of here. Now things are settled down. So what's it worth? What are we actually getting from all this? Is it actually worthwhile and so on? And have there been problems from before? So comparing what was going on before, looking at the situation now, helps them understand changes and so on. And obviously when you deal with places like Yorkshire, we haven't got that one here, you see some big problems because of the fighting that went on there earlier on and so on.
What's a rad man or a rad knight?
That's another kind of individual. It's ride man or something like that, I think. It's another, then they occur in certain parts of Domesday Book as well, and so on, as an individual person. So, taken as a whole, okay, we've got a description. We don't have any pigs and sheep mentioned in the examples we've got here, but you do get occasionally animals mentioned. And as I said, at a certain stage, they filtered out some of the detail when they were abridging and editing the accounts to make the final one. so the pigs may have been in there originally. But you have a fairly thorough analysis, not geographically in the final arrangement, but according to landowner, okay? And that means, you know, what do these people owe to me, in a sense? I'm not concerned just with the land, but with the people who are controlling the land. And what do these guys mean to me? What do they have to pay to me? Or what are they receiving, which I can then claim, and things like that, and they're under me. So it's both a land assessment, but also an assessment according to people in that sense. Okay, my last question is, if you were an historian and you were required to study this document, and the job I had before I came here was kind of partly involved databasing certain aspects of Domesday Book, so I've kind of claimed to have read the whole thing, though it wasn't something I did for fun, but it was still very interesting. What kinds of things could you think an historian could get out of this document? It doesn't tell stories very often. It tells little stories now and again, so it's not a sort of continuous narrative, but it's a very important historical source, and it will continue to be used by historians for a long time, I'm sure. What kinds of things might we get from this?
Things we've already mentioned, I guess. You can see the relationship between church land and the king. You could look at the difference between pre-Norman conquest and after.
Yeah, okay, let's take a couple of those and then put kind of other things in. I mean, obviously, on the very basic level, this is kind of economic history. Okay, you can look at the economic nature, you don't get down to the physical land, but you get as close as you can to looking actually at the organisation of villages and other things in late 11th century England. And you can so a number of studies have been done basically using Domesday Book as a way of understanding the economy of England at the time of William the Conqueror, and therefore, as Genghis says, also earlier, because we get information but not as much detail about what was going on at the end of Edward's reign as well. What else might we study here? What is this full of? It's full of people, so we can look at people history. Little people who are anonymous, they have no names, 15 Bordals, 11 villains, and so on. We might be able to work on population history here. Attempts have been done to estimate the population of England based upon these things. That's a bit more difficult to do, but it's clearly an important aspect of that. Big people as well, okay? The feudal hierarchy is there, how these people are related, and how those important people now may or may not be connected to people before. To take the example we had of the King's Land, it said, the king holds, where is it, Linton, King Edward held it. Straight away you think, wait a minute, okay, so King William's got this manor, but also a previous king, the Anglo-Saxon king, and we draw a line and say change of dynasty and all that, but there's continuity here. And we often find, if you make all this into a database or whatever, you can compare the current holder, the king or one of his tenants or subtenants, and then if you get the information about the previous tenant, there's often quite consistency, okay? So the guys who've got land in different parts of the country are often gaining the land of the same earlier Anglo-Saxon landholders. There's continuity, okay, in these cases. They're inheriting pockets of land and individual manors that the same person often had held. And that might tell you a bit about the way that the kingdom was moved from Anglo-Saxon to Norman organisation and so forth. There are thousands of names in this document. Personal names, the names of the people, of course, and the names of places. Some of the places in England including my village in North Wales, make their first appearance in historical document in Domesday Book. The first time they are ever mentioned is in here. Okay, so we can look at things like place name development, we can look at language and so forth by analysing the forms of the names of places and people as well, because these are often the oldest records of these things. And names take us further back to when they were first given to a place, not just to the 11th century and so on. As we said, it deals not only with lay, secular landholders, it also deals with church landholders, and so we can move away from political, social history into ecclesiastical history and how churches supported themselves and their dealings and so forth and things like that as well. So almost every aspect of 11th century history can in one way or another be looked at here. Okay, and even for me, a Welsh historian, you see there's no real reference to Wales here, but Wales is described very loosely and in some cases a little bit more detail in Domesday Book. It's not indicated on there because the circuit's kind of moved in from the English places. But if you look on page 494, the list of guys, okay, we have number 31, the Welsh name Griffith, and we can connect him in theory to Welshmen we know from the political Welsh scene, so we can identify him and then we can put him into understand what's going on, how he's not just a Welsh politician, but he's obviously got some relationship with the English, and that helps us to understand the relationship between the Anglo-Norman England and what was going on in independent Wales and things like that. So whether it's English history and Welsh history, nothing to do with Scottish history in this case, but England and Wales, politics, society, economy, religion and so on, all of the things are in here. Okay, so it's a very, very important source. And we owe it all to William the Conqueror, the man who won the Battle of Hastings. Okay, we've gone slightly over time. I shall stop there.